Aisha adjusted the delicate folds of her silk scarf, its soft shimmer catching the sunlight as she moved through the bustling market. To the world, she was the perfect image of a devoted wife, her head held high with an air of grace and dignity. Her husband, Samir, a man of considerable wealth and influence, was widely respected for his discipline and work ethic. Their union was one envied by many, a seemingly harmonious blend of tradition and privilege. Yet beneath the polished veneer of their marriage, Aisha felt the relentless ache of emptiness. She often replayed the early days of their relationship in her mind, hoping to find fragments of the love she had once believed in. Samir had wooed her not with flowers or poems but with promises of stability and security. It was the kind of love that, in the eyes of her family and community, was supposed to last. But as the years passed, his affection had hardened into routine, his once kind gestures buried under the weight of his demanding career. Their conversations, once vibrant and filled with shared dreams, had dwindled to mere exchanges about household matters and social obligations. Aisha had never imagined that a marriage so outwardly perfect could feel so lonely. She spent her days fulfilling her duties, managing the household, attending charity events, and appearing at Samir's side during social gatherings. But as the nights stretched long and silent, her mind wandered to forbidden places, places where passion and desire still existed. It was during one of those restless evenings that she discovered the cafe. Tucked away on a quiet street far from the prying eyes of her social circle, it became her refuge. Here, she could sip her coffee undisturbed, the hum of life around her a soothing contrast to the sterile silence of her home. It was here, too, that she first saw them. Mark was the first to approach her. His easy smile and sparkling blue eyes caught her off guard as he asked if the seat across from her was taken. There was something magnetic about his confidence, the way he spoke with a playful lilt that made her laugh despite herself. She didn't realize until much later that he had stayed far longer than necessary for a simple cup of coffee. Lucas came next, his entrance as understated as Mark's had been bold. He was seated at a table near the window, a book in hand, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he read. Aisha had noticed him glancing her way but dismissed it as coincidence until, one afternoon, he caught her gaze and held it. When he finally approached her, it wasn't with words but with a shy smile and a question about her favorite author. Their conversation flowed easily, his quiet intellect a stark contrast to Mark's exuberant charm. And then there was Stefan, the last and most unpredictable of the trio. His energy filled the room the moment he walked in, his laughter loud and unrestrained. He noticed her immediately, a flash of interest lighting up his face as he made his way over. "You look like someone who needs a little adventure," he said, his voice rich with confidence. Aisha couldn't help but smile at his audacity. At first, she convinced herself that the attention meant nothing, that these encounters were harmless diversions from her otherwise monotonous life. But as the days turned into weeks, she found herself lingering at the cafe, her heart quickening at the possibility of seeing one, or all, of them. Each man offered her something she had been missing: Mark's playful affection, Lucas's thoughtful conversations, Stefan's thrilling spontaneity. Together, they filled the void inside her in a way Samir never could. She told herself it was innocent. A shared laugh here, a stolen glance there. But the lines began to blur as her emotions deepened. Mark started brushing his hand against hers as he passed her a coffee cup. Lucas lingered closer than necessary, his voice low and intimate when they spoke. Stefan's boldness escalated, his teasing becoming more suggestive. Each interaction left her both exhilarated and racked with guilt. At home, Samir remained oblivious, his focus consumed by his work. Aisha became an expert at hiding her double life, her practiced smile concealing the turmoil within. Yet, even as she basked in the attention of her three admirers, a sense of unease began to creep into her thoughts. She had always been careful, but the thrill of her deception was addictive, and with each passing day, she ventured closer to the edge. The moment that would set everything in motion came one rainy afternoon. She had been sitting with Lucas, their conversation turning to the kind of intimate revelations that felt too dangerous yet too enticing to resist. Mark walked in, his expression faltering as he saw them together. Aisha quickly made an excuse to leave, her heart pounding as she stepped into the rain. She hadn't noticed Stefan watching from the shadows, his gaze dark and unreadable. As she hurried home, her scarf clinging damply to her hair, Aisha felt the first stirrings of panic. Her world, so carefully constructed, was beginning to show cracks. But even as fear gripped her, she couldn't bring herself to stop. The pull of her desires was too strong, the promise of escape too tempting. When she reached her front door, she paused, her hand resting on the handle. Inside was the life she had chosen, the life she was bound to by vows and tradition. But outside, in the rain-soaked streets, was the life she secretly longed for, a life filled with passion, danger, and possibilities she could barely imagine. She closed her eyes, her breath hitching as the weight of her choices pressed down on her. Then, with a final, trembling exhale, she stepped inside, leaving the rain, and the three men, behind her for now. Aisha's double life flourished with a dangerous momentum, each encounter pulling her deeper into a web of deceit that seemed to grow tighter around her. Days were reserved for her role as Samir's dutiful wife, where she maintained the perfect facade of poise and loyalty. Nights, however, brought an intoxicating blend of excitement and guilt as she navigated her secret affairs with Mark, Lucas, and Stefan. Each man, so different yet equally captivating, occupied a distinct place in her heart, their presence feeding her hunger for something she couldn't quite name but desperately craved. Mark was her escape into light-hearted joy, his playful charm and effortless humor making her feel young and alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. He would often surprise her with little gestures, a handwritten note, a favorite dessert, or a walk through the vibrant city streets. With him, she could let down her guard and laugh freely, unburdened by the expectations of her marriage or the suffocating weight of appearances. Yet, his casual affection sometimes left her questioning whether he truly understood the depth of the risk she was taking. Lucas, in contrast, drew her into a world of intellectual intimacy that both thrilled and unnerved her. Their conversations often lingered long after the cafe had emptied, delving into topics that made her see the world, and herself, differently. He spoke with a quiet intensity that made her feel seen in ways she hadn't realized she needed. But there was something about Lucas's sharp gaze, the way he seemed to watch her even when she wasn't looking, that hinted at an awareness beyond what she revealed. His ability to read between the lines of her carefully crafted stories made her feel both exposed and deeply connected. Stefan, as always, was a storm. His energy was contagious, his boldness irresistible. He had a way of making the forbidden feel like a thrilling adventure, pulling her into spontaneous escapades that left her breathless. But his unpredictability was also a source of tension. Stefan was not a man who took kindly to being deceived, and though he never voiced it outright, Aisha sensed that he wasn't blind to the fact that she wasn't fully his. The way his eyes darkened when she brushed off his questions or changed the subject sent a shiver down her spine, a mix of fear and exhilaration that she couldn't shake. Balancing her time between the three men became a game of precision, one that demanded constant vigilance and creativity. She would tell Mark she had a family obligation, only to spend the evening with Lucas, sharing whispered confessions in a dimly lit corner of the cafe. She would assure Lucas she needed some time alone, then lose herself in the thrill of Stefan's reckless plans. Her lies came so easily now, each one slipping from her lips with practiced ease, but the cost of maintaining them began to show. Nights were spent staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with scenarios of what would happen if even one piece of her fragile charade fell apart. Samir, though often distracted by his work, was not entirely oblivious to the changes in her. He noticed the subtle shifts in her behavior, the way she lingered too long over her phone, the small but significant changes in her wardrobe, the spark in her eyes that seemed to appear and disappear without explanation. At first, he dismissed it as a phase, perhaps a result of boredom or a desire for some harmless excitement. But as weeks turned into months, his suspicions grew. He began arriving home unexpectedly, his sudden presence a test she barely managed to pass each time. The tension between them, though unspoken, hung heavy in the air, a silent reminder that the walls of her carefully built double life were closing in. The first crack appeared on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. Mark had invited her for a late lunch, his easy grin promising a reprieve from the growing pressure of her lies. She had agreed, eager for a moment of normalcy in the chaos her life had become. But as they laughed over shared stories, she caught a glimpse of Lucas entering the same cafe. Her heart stopped as he scanned the room, his eyes narrowing when they landed on her. She felt the blood drain from her face, her mind scrambling for an excuse even as Lucas approached their table. Mark turned, his smile fading into confusion as Lucas greeted her with a tone that was far too familiar. "What a coincidence," Lucas said, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of tension. "I didn't know you'd be here today." Aisha's mind raced, every instinct telling her to run, to escape the collision course she had unknowingly set in motion. But before she could respond, Stefan appeared, his arrival like a gust of wind that sent everything spiraling further out of control. He greeted them with his usual confidence, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, until his eyes flicked between Mark and Lucas, realization dawning like a thunderclap. The air grew thick with unspoken accusations, each man's gaze locking onto hers as if demanding an explanation she couldn't possibly provide. For the first time, Aisha felt the full weight of her deception, the fragile threads of her lies unraveling before her eyes. She stood, her voice trembling as she muttered an excuse about needing to leave, but Stefan's hand caught her wrist, his grip firm and unyielding. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his tone soft but dangerously resolute. "Not until you tell us what's really going on." Panic surged through her, but before she could respond, Mark stood, his usual playfulness replaced by a cold intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "I think we all deserve an explanation, don't we?" Lucas said nothing, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of betrayal and quiet fury that was somehow worse than Stefan's aggression or Mark's anger. Aisha felt the room closing in around her, the walls pressing tighter with every second that passed. She opened her mouth to speak, to say anything that might diffuse the situation, but no words came. In that moment, she realized that the life she had built, the delicate balance she had so carefully maintained, was no longer hers to control. The lies that had once protected her were now a noose tightening around her neck, and the people she had once trusted to keep her secrets were now the ones most likely to expose them. Her world, so meticulously constructed, was crumbling, and all she could do was watch as the pieces fell. When she finally broke free from Stefan's grasp and fled into the crowded streets, she didn't look back. Her heart pounded as she ran, the voices of the men echoing in her ears like a haunting refrain. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do next, but one thing was certain: the secrets she had fought so hard to protect were no longer safe. And as she disappeared into the city's shadows, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of her unraveling. The days after the confrontation at the cafe unfolded in a haze of tension and fear for Aisha. She had managed to escape that night, her heart pounding as she fled the accusing stares of Mark, Lucas, and Stefan, but the fallout from her actions was only just beginning. Every step she took felt heavy with dread, every shadow a reminder that her secrets were no longer hidden. At home, Samir's gaze seemed sharper, his questions more probing. Aisha couldn't tell if he suspected anything or if it was her own paranoia playing tricks on her, but either way, the walls were closing in. Mark was the first to reach out. His text arrived the next morning, a simple question that belied the turmoil beneath the surface. "Can we talk?" Aisha stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, her mind replaying the way his expression had shifted from confusion to anger the night before. She didn't reply. Instead, she deleted the message and turned off her phone, hoping that ignoring him would somehow make the problem go away. It didn't. By the evening, Lucas had found a way to contact her, too. Unlike Mark, he wasn't angry, at least, not outwardly. His message was calm, almost clinical, but the words cut deeper than any accusation. "Who are you really, Aisha?" She felt a pang of guilt as she read his text, his quiet hurt more devastating than Stefan's inevitable fury. She wanted to explain, to make him understand why she had done what she did, but how could she justify something she barely understood herself? Stefan, predictably, didn't bother with subtlety. His call came late that night, his voice sharp and demanding. "We need to talk," he said, the words a command rather than a request. Aisha's hand trembled as she held the phone to her ear, her throat dry as she tried to think of a response. Before she could say anything, he continued, his tone laced with both anger and a strange, dangerous edge of affection. "You can't keep running, Aisha. Not from me." She hung up without replying, her heart racing as she stared at the phone in her hand. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of her choices. For the first time, she realized that she wasn't just in over her head, she was drowning, and there was no one to save her. The next day, Samir announced that he would be working from home for the foreseeable future. Aisha's chest tightened at the news, the implications clear. Whether he had suspicions or simply wanted to keep a closer eye on her, it was obvious that her freedom was slipping away. She tried to act normal, her smile forced as she prepared his tea and listened to him talk about his latest business ventures, but every word felt like a lie. The life she had built with him now seemed like a prison, the walls closing in tighter with every passing moment. But it wasn't just Samir who was closing in. Mark, Lucas, and Stefan were no longer content to wait for her to come to them. Mark showed up at the cafe the next day, his presence a sharp reminder of the life she had tried to compartmentalize. She saw him from a distance and turned to leave, but he caught up to her before she could escape. "Aisha," he said, his voice softer than she expected. "I just want to talk." She hesitated, her resolve wavering as she looked into his eyes. There was hurt there, yes, but also something that made her chest tighten, an echo of the connection they had once shared. Against her better judgment, she nodded, allowing him to lead her to a quiet corner of the cafe. "I don't understand," he began, his voice low but insistent. "Was any of it real? Or was I just one of many?" The question cut through her, his vulnerability a painful reminder of what she had done. She wanted to tell him the truth, to explain that she had never meant to hurt him, that she had been searching for something she couldn't find in her marriage. But the words caught in her throat, tangled in a web of guilt and fear. Instead, she muttered a weak apology, her gaze fixed on the table as she fought to hold back tears. Mark sighed, his frustration evident, but he didn't press her further. "I just hope you figure out what you want," he said finally, his tone a mixture of resignation and lingering affection. "Before it's too late." She didn't know how to respond, and by the time she looked up, he was already walking away. The sight of him leaving, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of her betrayal, was almost too much to bear. Lucas was next. He didn't approach her in public, instead waiting until she was alone in the safety of her home. Or so she thought. When she found him waiting outside her gate one evening, his expression unreadable, her heart sank. "Lucas," she began, her voice shaky as she stepped outside to meet him. "You shouldn't be here." "I need answers," he said, his tone calm but firm. "You owe me that much." She wanted to deny it, to tell him that he had no right to demand anything from her, but the truth was undeniable. She did owe him, if not answers, then at least an acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. But before she could speak, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut through the air. Samir's car. Panic surged through her as she turned to Lucas, her voice urgent. "You have to go. Now." But Lucas didn't move. His gaze flicked to the car, then back to her, his expression hardening as realization dawned. "He doesn't know, does he? Please," she whispered, desperation clear in her voice. "Just go." For a moment, she thought he might refuse, that he might stay and force her to confront the very things she had been trying to avoid. But then, with a small nod, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices alone. As Samir stepped out of the car, his eyes narrowing as they landed on her, Aisha felt the weight of her lies pressing down on her like never before. She smiled, hoping to mask her unease, but the look on his face told her that he wasn't entirely convinced. The tension between them was palpable as they went inside, each step a reminder that her carefully constructed world was teetering on the edge of collapse. And though the walls hadn't yet fallen, Aisha knew it was only a matter of time. The days that followed were a labyrinth of anxiety and uncertainty, each moment burdened by the weight of Aisha's choices. Her once carefully compartmentalized life was now a tangled web of fear, guilt, and an unshakable sense of foreboding. Samir's presence at home had grown increasingly oppressive. His silences stretched longer, his glances sharper, and his questions more probing. Though he said nothing outright, Aisha could feel the scrutiny, a constant pressure that threatened to crack her fragile composure. But the real danger didn't lie within her home. It lurked outside, in the form of the three men whose lives she had entangled with her own. She hadn't spoken to Mark since their conversation at the cafe, though his words haunted her. Lucas had stopped contacting her altogether, his absence more troubling than any confrontation. And Stefan. Stefan was a storm brewing just beyond the horizon, unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. Aisha tried to maintain the routines of her life, clinging to them like a lifeline. She attended charity events, hosted dinners, and went through the motions of being the perfect wife. But the mask she wore felt heavier with each passing day, the strain of her duplicity carving invisible scars into her soul. The nights were the worst. In the silence of her bedroom, as Samir slept beside her, her mind churned with thoughts of what might happen if her secrets were exposed. She played out countless scenarios, each more devastating than the last, but no amount of planning could prepare her for the reality that awaited. It came one evening, unannounced and unstoppable. Aisha was alone in the living room, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the armrest of the sofa as she tried to calm the storm inside her. The sound of the doorbell startled her, the chime cutting through the quiet like a knife. She hesitated, her heart pounding as she approached the door. Through the peephole, she saw Stefan standing on the front steps, his expression unreadable but his presence unmistakably threatening. Opening the door felt like stepping into the lion's den, but Aisha knew she had no choice. "Stefan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room before landing on her. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Aisha closed the door behind him, her mind racing as she tried to anticipate what he might say. "This isn't a good time," she began, her voice trembling. "Samir is home." "I don't care," he interrupted, his gaze piercing. "You've been avoiding me, Aisha. I'm not going to let you run away this time." The accusation in his voice stung, but it was the intensity in his eyes that truly unsettled her. Stefan had always been bold, but there was something different about him now, something darker, more dangerous. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to create distance, but he followed, closing the gap between them. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You've been playing games with all of us, treating us like we're disposable. Did you think we wouldn't find out? Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? Keep your voice down," she hissed, glancing toward the hallway. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt anyone." "Then what did you want, Aisha?" Stefan pressed, his tone laced with both anger and desperation. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you wanted everything, without caring about who you destroyed in the process." The words struck her like a physical blow, the truth in them undeniable. She had been selfish, driven by her own desires and unwilling to face the repercussions of her actions. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Samir appeared, his expression a mix of confusion and suspicion as he took in the scene before him. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice steady but his eyes sharp. Aisha's heart stopped, her mind scrambling for an explanation. "He's a friend," she stammered, the lie sounding hollow even to her own ears. "He was just leaving." Stefan didn't move. His gaze shifted to Samir, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before his lips curved into a humorless smile. "I think we should all have a little chat, don't you?" Samir's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening as he turned to Aisha. "What's going on here?" The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter as the weight of her lies threatened to crush her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Stefan took a step closer, his voice low but carrying an edge that sent a chill down her spine. Maybe it's time your husband knew the truth. No, Aisha said, her voice breaking as she reached for Stefan's arm. Please don't. But it was too late. The truth, once hidden so carefully, spilled out like a dam that had finally burst. Stefan's words were sharp and deliberate, each one a dagger aimed at the foundation of her life. He spoke of the cafe, of the nights they had spent together, of the other men she had been seeing. He didn't hold back, his anger fueling his every word as Samir's expression shifted from confusion to shock to something far worse. When Stefan finished, the silence that followed was deafening. Samir turned to Aisha, his eyes filled with a mixture of betrayal and fury that made her knees weak. Is it true? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Have you been lying to me this whole time? Aisha couldn't meet his gaze. Tears blurred her vision as she nodded, the weight of her guilt too heavy to deny. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words inadequate but all she could manage. Samir took a step back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment she thought he might lash out, but instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with Stefan. She collapsed onto the sofa, her sobs shaking her body as the reality of her actions came crashing down. Stefan watched her, his expression softening but his resolve unshaken. You did this to yourself, Aisha, he said, his voice quieter now. I hope it was worth it. And then he was gone, leaving her to face the ruins of her life. As the front door closed behind him, Aisha buried her face in her hands, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like never before. The life she had built was gone, shattered by her own hands, and all that remained was the wreckage.